How do you stop 800 men who have nothing left to lose? That was the question sitting in the Ottoman trenches east of Beersheba on the afternoon of the 31st of October, 1917. And the answer the defenders reached was reasonable, professional, and completely wrong. They had fortified trenches, machine guns, artillery, 2 aircraft, and the most experienced garrison on the entire Gaza-Beersheba line. Every calculation they had made rested on the same assumption: that mounted infantry charging fortified positions across 4 miles of bare, flat desert is not a tactic. It is a funeral procession. What they had not accounted for was that the men riding toward them had been without water for nearly 24 hours, that their horses were at the outer limit of what the desert allowed, and that the wells beneath that town were the only water for 30 miles in any direction. Stay with this until the end, because what happened on that plain in the last light of an October afternoon did not just win a battle. It broke an empire. To understand why 800 Australian stockmen found themselves galloping toward Ottoman machine guns on a Wednesday evening in the southern Palestinian desert, you first have to understand what 3 years of war in that region had produced. The Ottoman Empire entered the First World War in late 1914 as a central power, and its entry immediately threatened the thing the British valued most in the region: the Suez Canal, through which flowed the resources of the entire British Empire. Egypt had been under British occupation since 1882. When the Ottomans joined the war, the British made it a formal protectorate and flooded it with more than 70,000 troops from India, Australia, and New Zealand. Their main concern was the canal, and their concern was not unfounded. In the first weeks of January 1915, an Ottoman force of 25,000 men crossed 100 miles of waterless Sinai and attacked British defenses along the canal. They brought with them not only boats and heavy artillery, but 25 corrugated iron pontoons, prefabricated in Germany and smuggled through pro-German Bulgaria. The logistical audacity was extraordinary. The execution was not. French aircraft spotted the columns before they reached the canal. The Arab tribesmen who were supposed to screen the Ottoman advance never materialized. Only 1 pontoon made it into the water. The Ottomans lost 2,000 men and retreated back across the desert, having failed in their immediate objective, but opened a theater of war that would consume the next 3 years. What followed was the slow, methodical British advance across the Sinai Peninsula. General Archibald Murray built a standard-gauge railway following an ancient caravan route, a 12-inch pipeline carrying water from the Nile, and a defensive network linking the desert oases. By December 1916, Murray's forces had crossed the Sinai entirely, captured the border towns of El Arish and Rafah, and stood at the edge of Ottoman Palestine. It was during this advance that an Australian officer named Harry Chauvel began developing the understanding that would matter most 18 months later outside Beersheba. Commanding the ANZAC Mounted Division, he defeated a Turkish force of 12,000 at the Battle of Romani in August 1916. His men outfighting a larger enemy in blazing heat by using the mobility the desert rewarded. At Magdaba in December of that year, he led a night march across waterless ground, encircled a garrison before it could respond, and captured 1,300 prisoners at a cost of 22 dead. 2 engagements, 2 lessons recorded in the memory of a man who did not forget them: that mounted troops who understood desert terrain could position themselves where an enemy believed positioning was impossible, and that a silent night approach conducted under strict discipline could bring a force to the edge of a prepared defense before anyone inside knew it was coming. These were not abstract principles absorbed from a textbook. They were hard experiences accumulated in hard conditions by a man who was still accumulating them when the Third Battle of Gaza began. because the Third Battle of Gaza was not actually about Gaza. Murray had tried twice. The First Battle of Gaza, in March 1917, had come agonizingly close. British cavalry actually encircled the town. Infantry nearly captured it. And then Murray convinced himself the cavalry was too low on water to continue and ordered a withdrawal. His own men were enraged at having surrendered what they had won. The Second Battle of Gaza in April was worse. The Ottomans had spent the intervening weeks building trenches, stringing barbed wire, emplacing machine guns, and turning the coastal city into a genuine fortress. Murray responded by deploying 4,000 gas-tipped artillery shells that evaporated in the desert heat, and 8 tanks whose machinery clogged in the fine sand. 6,500 British casualties against approximately 2,000 Ottoman. A Western Front battle transported to the desert and producing Western Front results. London dismissed Murray. David Lloyd George, who had become Prime Minister in December 1916, had lost patience with cautious commanders and produced a demand: Jerusalem by Christmas. The man he chose to deliver it was not the sort who made promises he did not intend to keep. Lieutenant General Sir Edmund Allenby arrived in Cairo in late June of 1917, and the Egyptian expeditionary force he inherited felt the difference within weeks. He was barrel-chested, physically imposing, with an explosive temper that had earned him the nickname the Bull. Murray had commanded from a desk in the Savoy Hotel in Cairo. Allenby moved his headquarters to the front lines. He appeared without warning at forward positions, inspected what he found, and remembered everything. His men lived in genuine fear of his surprise visits, and they also came quickly to understand that a commander who could be found at the front was a fundamentally different proposition from one who could not. His biography was a weapon of a particular kind. He had learned what mobile cavalry could do in open terrain during the Boer War, led the British Cavalry Division during the retreat from Mons in 1914. At Arras in April 1917, the battle immediately before his reassignment to Egypt, his Third Army had failed to exploit a breakthrough, and his transfer to the Middle East was understood in some quarters as a form of demotion. He arrived in Cairo with something to prove, and a theater that suited his instincts precisely. In the vast open spaces of southern Palestine, a cavalryman's feel for movement and flanking maneuver was not an anachronism. It was the essential quality. He immediately adopted a plan developed by one of his most capable subordinates, Lieutenant General Philip Chetwode, which proposed doing what 2 battles at Gaza had demonstrated was impossible: not breaking the Ottoman defensive line, but going around the end of it. The line ran 25 miles southeast from Gaza on the Mediterranean coast to the desert town of Beersheba at the foot of the Judean hills. Gaza was the fortress, reinforced, barbed-wired, bristling with guns. Beersheba was the hinge. Take the hinge, and the door swings open. There was one problem with the hinge, and it was the same problem that governed everything in that theater: water. Beersheba sat on 17 wells, the only reliable source for 30 miles in any direction. The Ottoman commanders had constructed their eastern defenses with the confidence of men who understood the desert's arithmetic. No large force could cross the waterless ground east of the town to attack from that direction. They were right about the ground. They had not fully considered what would happen if a force could be brought to the edge of that waterless ground, fully watered, timed to arrive at the moment of attack, carrying enough to sustain the approach. Chauvel solved this by consulting the records of the Palestine Exploration Fund and questioning local Arab informants who directed him to ancient wells at Asluj, pre-Islamic water sources unused for centuries. 2 weeks of engineering work restored them to function. That act of historical detective work was the logistical precondition for everything that followed. Without the Asluj wells, the attack on Beersheba from the east was a theoretical exercise. With them, it was a plan. What remained was making certain the Ottomans did not know what was coming. Allenby's intelligence staff produced one of the more audacious deception operations of the entire war. In mid-September, a British officer rode toward Ottoman lines with a small party, deliberately attracted the attention of an enemy patrol, exchanged shots, and retreated while leaving behind a haversack spattered with his horse's blood. Inside was a large sum of cash, forged personal letters, a map with unit positions marked, and documents outlining plans for a main attack on Gaza, with a diversionary feint toward Beersheba. The Ottoman patrol found the haversack and sent it immediately to Kress von Kressenstein, the German general commanding the Ottoman Eighth Army, who read it and concluded that his existing assessment had been correct all along. Whether the officer who dropped it was the intelligence chief, Major Richard Meinertzhagen, who claimed the operation as his own for decades afterward, or Captain A.C.B. Neal, historians have been disputing this since the 1980s, and Brian Garfield's research suggests that nearly every detail Meinertzhagen claimed about his own role was fabricated. What is not in dispute is that Kressenstein received the haversack and believed it. Additional deceptions ran simultaneously. A dummy encampment on Cyprus suggested a pending amphibious landing behind Ottoman lines. Fake railway construction proceeded near Gaza. The signals traffic directed at Ottoman intercept stations pointed consistently northward. The actual approach columns moved at night under strict light and noise discipline, with zinc water tanks covered by blankets during daylight hours to prevent detection from German and Ottoman reconnaissance aircraft. The Jewish Neely spy ring, operating behind Ottoman lines, provided detailed maps of the defensive positions that would prove invaluable when the attack began. By the time the assault force was in motion, Kressenstein was so certain of his assessment that he had made a personal promise to the man defending the town he believed was secure. On the 15th of October, 1917, Kressenstein visited the headquarters of Ismet Bey, the Ottoman colonel commanding the Beersheba garrison. Ismet Bey had requested reinforcements, particularly additional troops to extend and complete the trench lines on the eastern side of the town, which remained unfinished and critically unwired. Kressenstein told him the reinforcements were unnecessary. The British were going to attack Gaza. Beersheba was safe. Beersheba was not safe. But the men who would prove that had not yet arrived. The town itself was an unlikely object for the calculations of empires, ancient in ways that the word ancient inadequately captures. Beersheba means well of the oath in the Hebrew of the book of Genesis, the same name, the same water, that Abraham and Isaac had made their covenants over with the rulers of the region. 20 centuries of armies had fought over it, for the same reason the Australians were about to. Whoever controls the water in the desert controls whether the army lives or dies. In recent years, the Ottomans had developed the settlement into something resembling a prosperous administrative center, a hospital, army barracks, a railway station with a water tower, engine sheds, stone buildings with red-tiled roofs, and, in a detail that captured something essential about the German influence in the Ottoman military, a German beer garden, a European outpost at the edge of the Negev. Beneath this civilian surface, the military reality was more complicated. The trench system protecting the town was strongest to the west and south, where the most obvious approach routes lay. Those sectors were deep, well-sighted, and covered by interlocking fields of fire. Eastward, the picture changed. The trenches on the eastern side were shallower, less complete, and without the barbed wire that slowed an attacker in every other sector. Ismet Bey had approximately 1,000 frontline riflemen defending the perimeter, supplemented by support troops, clerks, and orderlies, who brought the garrison's total strength higher, but its combat effectiveness considerably lower. He had 9 machine guns and 20 field guns. A significant portion of his frontline infantry consisted of Arab conscripts, men whose loyalty to the Sultan's cause was, as the official reports put it, in the careful language of professional assessments that cannot say what they mean directly, uncertain. Standing 3 kilometers east of the town, as if placed by a military textbook to illustrate the concept of key terrain, was Tel el Saba, a 1,000-foot rocky prominence whose machine gun nests and artillery positions commanded every approach from the east. While Tel el Saba held, any attack across the eastern plain was theoretical. When it fell, the plain was open. That distinction would determine whether the battle was won in daylight or lost in darkness. Kressenstein left Ismet Bey's headquarters convinced the eastern defenses were an academic concern. He had the haversack. He had weeks of signals intelligence. He had the desert's own arithmetic on his side. No large mounted force could appear from the east without water, and there was no water. He was not a careless commander. He was a careful commander who had been carefully deceived. The men who were going to cross that eastern plain in the last light of a Tuesday afternoon had been riding since October 28th. They were not professional cavalry in the European sense. The 4th Light Horse Brigade was composed almost entirely of volunteers from rural Australia, stockmen, ringers, jackaroos, horsebreakers from the paddocks and properties of New South Wales and Victoria. Before the war, they had spent their working lives doing the things that would matter on the afternoon of October 31st. Galloping across open ground, shooting from horseback, reading terrain in darkness, navigating by stars, managing horses in conditions that would have defeated a city-bred man and his city-bred animal. The civilian skill set and the military requirement were, in this theater and this action, almost identical. No training program produces a horseman who can navigate by compass at full gallop and judge ground at speed in the dark. The Outback had been producing them for a generation. The 4th Regiment, the Victorians, had been formed on the 11th of August 1914 and sailed from Melbourne in October of that year. Several men had been at Gallipoli, fighting dismounted in the trenches with the infantry, and they carried the particular frustration of being skilled at something for which that theater had no use. The 12th Regiment, from New South Wales, was commanded on the day of the charge by Lieutenant Colonel Donald Cameron, whose after-action report, written 2 days later, would become one of the clearest primary documents the battle produced. The 11th Regiment, largely Queensland-raised with 1 squadron from South Australia, was part of the brigade, but had been detached on other duty and would follow into Beersheba when they could. Among the approximately 100 Indigenous light horsemen in the brigade was a particular irony that the official records did not comment on, and the participants were perhaps too exhausted to articulate. They were not yet Australian citizens by law. The federal franchise had not been extended to Aboriginal Australians. They could not vote, could not access most public benefits, had no formal standing in the nation whose uniform they wore. They were, by every legal measure, non-citizens of Australia fighting for the empire, whose member state had not recognized their membership. They rode into the same darkness and carried the same water ration and faced the same Ottoman guns. Commanding the whole of it, sleeping on the sand when he slept at all, was Lieutenant General Chauvel, born in April 1865 on his father's cattle station at Tabulam in northern New South Wales, son of a grazier, educated at Sydney Grammar and Toowoomba Grammar, before returning to manage the family property. He became an accomplished horseman before he became a soldier, and the distinction mattered. His instincts about horses and ground had been formed by the land itself before any military academy could formalize them. He had won at Romani and Magdaba, become the first Australian to command a corps, and the first to reach the rank of lieutenant general. A British brigadier general had said to his face, on learning of the appointment, "Fancy giving the command of the biggest mounted force in the world's history to an Australian." Chauvel had noted it and moved on. He was not a showman. His grandson would later describe him as quiet, deeply uncomfortable in the public role of military command. He was the sort who slept on the sand and got on with it, and who would say of Beersheba years later that it was just a military decision at that particular time, and it worked. By dawn on October 31st, the attacking force was in position. The 4th Light Horse Brigade had arrived at Iswaiwin, approximately 6 kilometers southeast of the town. The men had unsaddled, fed their horses, and begun to wait. The battle was happening somewhere else. At dawn, more than 100 guns opened fire on the Ottoman positions southwest of Beersheba. The 60th London Division and the 74th Yeomanry Division attacked from the southwest in the approach that Kressenstein's haversack had told him was the real one. And for the first hours of October 31st, it must have appeared to Ottoman eyes that Kressenstein had been right all along. Hill 1070, the prominence commanding the southwestern trench lines, was the first objective. The artillery preparation worked. The infantry overran the position and pushed through toward the main trench line. Private Walter Keddy, in the wadi with the waiting light horse, recorded that the Turks started shelling them with heavy guns, and that good cover prevented casualties. They were spectators to the battle that was determining their survival, waiting for an order that had not yet been issued. Understand what was building here. If Beersheba was not taken by nightfall, the entire attacking force, men and horses both, faced a waterless night retreat across 30 miles of desert. There was no second option. 3 kilometers east of the town, Tel El Saba was the obstacle the morning's fighting had not yet addressed and could not ignore. The New Zealand Mounted Rifles Brigade and the 3rd Australian Light Horse attacked it, dismounted. And the word dismounted understates what that meant on that ground. Tel El Saba was rocky, exposed, and defended by Ottoman machine gunners with excellent fields of fire across the open approaches. Every advance toward the summit drew fire from positions above. The troops attacked in sections, some firing while others moved, and the grinding process was slow and expensive and without any alternative. By noon, the outer southwestern defenses had been overrun. The road north cut by the 2nd Light Horse Brigade at Tel El Sakati, but Tel El Saba held. The telegraph line to Beersheba had been cut around midday, leaving Ismet Bey increasingly isolated from his chain of command. He was managing a battle across multiple approaches, with degrading communications and depleting reserves. At 2:20 in the afternoon, the 1st Light Horse Brigade reported a squadron of Ottoman cavalry leaving Beersheba and moving north. It was the first visible sign that the garrison was beginning to calculate the geometry of retreat rather than defense. 10 minutes later, Ottoman field guns targeted the ANZAC Mounted Division's headquarters with high explosive shells. A final aggressive act from a force whose commander was already doing arithmetic about escape routes. At 2:30, Tel El Saba fell. The New Zealanders fixed bayonets at 200 yards and drove the attack home. The Ottoman garrison broke and retreated toward the town. The eastern approach to Beersheba was open. It was already 2:30 in the afternoon. Sunset in approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes. Beersheba still held. Its wells were intact and under demolition orders. In a wadi 6 kilometers to the southeast, 800 horsemen and their animals had been without water since the previous afternoon. At his Desert Mounted Corps headquarters, Chauvel received a telegram from General Allenby at Ex-Echo Corps headquarters at El Bukhar. The message was direct: capture Beersheba before nightfall. Chauvel reviewed the aerial photographs he had been carrying since the planning phase, the photographs that confirmed the absence of barbed wire on the eastern approaches, and looked at the plain between his position and the town's eastern edge. A cavalryman's instincts, developed across 30 years and proven at Romani and Magdaba, recognized the window that had opened. He had approximately 2 hours of usable light. He had a brigade that had been resting all day, while the rest of the force fought. He had 4 miles of bare, unobstructed, unwired ground. And he had a time limit that made the conventional approach, dismounted attack on foot, mathematically impossible. Brigadier General William Grant of the 4th Light Horse Brigade and Fitzgerald of the Yeomanry were both at headquarters. Both requested the assignment. The debate that followed was brief and went to the heart of what the Light Horse was. The Yeomanry commander argued that the Light Horse were mounted infantry, not cavalry. They had no sabers, no lances. They were not equipped for a mounted charge. The counter, which Chauvel had already reached independently, was that the absence of sabers was not the relevant variable. The eastern trenches had no wire. The open plain offered a target that moved too fast for artillery to range accurately, and the defenders would wait for the Australians to dismount before opening full fire, because mounted infantry always dismounted. If the Australians did not dismount, the defenders would be firing at a moving target at the wrong range. Chauvel's order, when he gave it, was 5 words. Put Grant straight at it. German and Ottoman aircraft had been strafing his headquarters all afternoon, and assembling the brigade took longer than it should have. While those minutes passed, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Ismet Bey issued 2 orders from his headquarters inside the town. The first, general retirement northward. The garrison would withdraw to the headquarters of the 143rd Regiment, approximately 10 kilometers up the road into the Judean hills. The second, the 27th Division's engineers were dispatched to the water supply with instructions to destroy it. Neither Chauvel nor Grant knew that both orders had been issued. Neither Ismet Bey nor his engineers knew that the 4th Light Horse Brigade was forming behind a ridge 6 kilometers away. 2 armies, 2 commands, the same minute. Grant rode personally to the 12th Regiment and addressed the men before they mounted. He was not a general given to speeches, and what he delivered was not one. Men, you are fighting for water. There's no water between this side of Beersheba and Asani. Use your bayonets as swords. I wish you the best of luck. It was a logistics briefing, and the simplicity was its power. 3 sentences that left no room for anything except the truth of the situation. The men understood what they had been told. 5 days earlier, on the 26th of October, Major General Hodgson had ordered the bayonet tips of the Light Horse sharpened. It was a routine maintenance order, the kind issued by conscientious regimental administration as a matter of course. Not a tactical calculation, not an anticipation of what was coming. Housekeeping. The steel that would, in 40 minutes, terrify the Ottoman defenders and help carry the most consequential mounted action of the First World War had been sharpened because someone was keeping the records straight. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, the 4th Regiment and the 12th Regiment formed up behind a ridge approximately 6 kilometers east of the town. The 4th was on the right, the 12th on the left. 3 lines of squadrons, each line 600 yards behind the one ahead, with 5 meters between each trooper. The 11th Regiment was ordered to follow when ready. Behind the main formation came 2 batteries of horse artillery and the stretcher bearers. The white dome of the Beersheba Mosque was visible from the ridge, the only clear landmark against the darkening terrain and the failing light. Private Keddy recorded, "We began to talk among ourselves, saying Beersheba will be taken, and us not doing anything, when about 5 o'clock, our major came and said that Beersheba had not been captured, but we were going in. They moved off at the trot. The advance started with a trot, steadied into a canter, and after approximately a mile, broke into a full gallop. 800 horses accelerating across 4 miles of bare desert in the last light of an October afternoon. the sound building from the ground up, the dust rising in great billowing clouds that the Ottoman lookouts could see from the town's eastern edge long before individual riders became distinguishable. 2 German aircraft appeared overhead and strafed the columns. The effect was negligible. The dust thrown up at the gallop made precision targeting impossible, and the speed meant the planes were always attacking a target that was no longer where it had been when they aligned their approach. Then the Ottoman artillery opened, and the mathematics of the situation began reasserting themselves in ways the defenders had not fully calculated. Shrapnel shells burst above the charging lines. Horses went down. Riders went down. Riderless horses, operating on the instinct and terror that horses have carried into battle since the first cavalry, continued at the gallop because the horses ahead of them were still galloping. Ion Idrius, a trooper from the 5th Brigade, watching through binoculars from a vantage point to the south, wrote afterward that he and the men around him laughed when the shells burst behind the charging line because the Turkish gunners had lost their nerve and forgotten to lower their sights. He was right. The Ottoman artillery was firing at where the horsemen had been, not where they were. A target moving at this speed, across this distance, was outside the practical experience of gunners trained to engage infantry advancing on foot. The shells burst behind the charging line and continued to burst behind it as the line moved forward faster than the gun crews could adjust. The standing order in the Ottoman trenches was to hold fire until the enemy dismounted. Mounted infantry always dismounted before the trenches. The defenders waited. The Australians did not dismount. Trooper Edward Dengate, riding with the 12th, described the final approach, the bullets getting thicker as they closed the distance, 3 or 4 horses going down around him, men instinctively running toward the carcasses of fallen animals to use them as cover, and then being carried forward by the momentum of 800 horses before the thought could be completed. He could see Turkish heads above the edge of the trench, squinting along rifle barrels. Some men dismounted at the trench line, thinking the order would come. Most did not. When the charging line was within a few hundred yards of the trench, the riders drew their bayonets, not to use them yet, to hold them up and let the blade catch the last October sun. The glinting steel, the speed, the scale of the thing, the noise. Ottoman soldiers began abandoning their positions before the Australians arrived. Not all of them. Many fought. The 12th Regiment on the left found the gap in the eastern defenses, the unwired section that Crescenstein had told Ismet Bey was unnecessary to complete. Captains Roby and Davies led their squadrons through it. Davies had been shouting since 3 miles out. "Come on, boys. Beersheba first stop." The 12th went through the gap and straight into the streets of the town. The 4th Regiment on the right met the deeper trench system, 3 lines in places, and the fighting there was of a different character entirely. Men leaped from their horses directly into the trenches with bayonets and pistols in hand, some using their rifles as clubs. Others stayed mounted and jumped the 10-foot ditches, continuing into the town. A gory trail marked where the trench line had been, horses whose abdomens had been torn open by Ottoman bayonets as they jumped, who had continued at the gallop on instinct until they collapsed. Staff Sergeant Jack Cox encountered a machine gun crew and 40 prisoners. He captured all of them using a revolver, and what was later described by men who were present as an evil look on his face. Trooper Thomas O'Leary, a Queensland man, raced ahead of his unit, captured 30 Ottoman soldiers by himself, then assisted in the capture of a field gun. He received the military medal. Major Cuthbert Featherstone-Hawes' horse was shot dead beneath him, and he took bullets through both thighs simultaneously. He put his horse out of its misery, positioned himself behind the carcass, and fired his revolver until he ran out of ammunition. He wrote to Captain Davies a week later to offer congratulations. I got a bullet through both thighs. It made a clean hole through the left, but opened out a bit and made a large gash through the back of the right, which will take a little while to fix up. Among the dead was Albert Cotter. He was 33 years old, born in Sydney in December 1883, the sixth and youngest son of a butcher from Glebe. He had played 21 test matches for Australia between 1904 and 1912, and was considered by many who faced him to be the fastest bowler of his era, a slinging, lethal action that broke stumps and ended careers, a pace so extreme that English fans had called him Terror Cotter with reason. He had been detailed that day as a stretcher bearer, not as a charging trooper. Sometime in the hours before the attack, he quietly swapped assignments with another light horseman because he wanted to be in the mounted action. He was shot dead at close range by a Turkish soldier as he was dismounting near the trench line. The trooper who found his body the following morning had not expected to find him there. He was buried 2 miles southeast of Beersheba, in the desert of a country whose government had not quite seen fit to list him as a full citizen, though it had been glad enough to take his service. Within 10 minutes of reaching the trenches, the town was in Australian hands. 2 explosions shook the streets in the midst of the fighting. A retreating German officer, acting on his own initiative, had detonated charges at 2 of the 17 wells before he was captured. He never reached a third. The margin between the campaign's success and its complete failure was a single arrest in a burning street. Ismet Bey and his staff fled north into the hills, some attempting to drag artillery pieces along roads the darkness was making impassable. A German staff officer captured that evening was later interviewed about what he had seen. When the charge began, he said, he had believed it was a feint, that no military reasoning he had been trained to follow could produce the conclusion that mounted infantry would press an assault of this kind home against prepared defenses. He had heard, he said, a great deal about the fighting quality of Australian soldiers. They were not soldiers at all. They were madmen. He had been trained in one of the most technically accomplished armies in modern history. He had produced, after watching 800 men on horseback break through 2 lines of trenches and capture a fortified town in 10 minutes, the honest professional verdict that his training had not prepared him for what he had seen. Nobody's had. As the sun set over the Judean hills on the 31st of October, 1917, Beersheba and the great majority of its wells were firmly in British hands. By 10 o'clock that evening, approximately 58,000 mounted troops and 100,000 animals had swarmed into the town. The water that the Ottoman engineers had been ordered to destroy before they fled was running through troughs and cisterns and the ancient stone wells that had been there since before the record of who dug them. It took 1,800,000 liters to address what the approach and the battle had cost the horses and the men in thirst. The wells that were the whole point of everything, the strategic objective, the logistical prerequisite, the reason 800 men had crossed 4 miles of desert under artillery fire in fading light, had been there for 30 centuries. They gave their water to the horses of the ANZAC mounted division without ceremony and without running dry. The next morning, Private Keddy rode out over the ground the charge had crossed to look for horses whose riders had been killed. He found only carcasses. The accounting of what the charge had cost was becoming clear. 31 light horsemen were killed in action. 36 were wounded. At least 70 whalers died, with more than 60 additional horses wounded. William Grant noted in his after-action report, in the careful language of a professional officer accounting for his losses, that the high percentage of killed to wounded was due to hand-to-hand fighting against superior numbers at the trenches, and that the majority of the wounded had fallen before the trench line was reached. Read literally, it is an inventory. Read as military men read it, with the understanding of what the words hand-to-hand fighting at the trenches meant in the physical reality of men who had jumped into those positions and fought at arm's length. It is the understated acknowledgement that the charge had worked, and that the cost of its working had been paid at the closest possible range. The British infantry, who had attacked from the southwest throughout the preceding day, the 60th London Division and the 74th Yeomanry, the men who broke the outer defenses and held Ismet Bey's attention from the west, while the Light Horse approached from the east, had suffered 171 killed in action. 5 times the mounted charge casualties for the preparatory work that made the charge possible. Their contribution vanished almost immediately into the longer shadow of the mounted action, as preparatory work generally does. Grant's formal report was precise: 59 officers and 1,090 other ranks taken prisoner, 9 field guns, 5 machine guns, large quantities of war materiel including rolling stock, transport vehicles, and animals. The catalogue of a garrison's collapse, itemized by a brigadier who had personally ridden to the start line and told his men the only water was in the town ahead. The Ottoman recriminations began almost immediately. Kressenstein, in his post-battle assessment, was critical of Ismet Bey's conduct of the defense. Ismet Bey, through the channels available to a defeated garrison commander, returned the criticism with interest by noting that Kressenstein had visited his headquarters 2 weeks before the attack and personally reassured him that reinforcements for the eastern defenses were unnecessary. Both men were arguing about who had failed the other, which was a professional way of acknowledging that Beersheba had failed them both. Kressenstein also produced something his critics were not obligated to volunteer: the acknowledgement that the understrength Turkish battalion defending Tel el-Saba had held 2 British cavalry divisions for 6 hours, and in doing so had fulfilled its obligation entirely. His tribute to the garrison's courage was not retrospective diplomacy. It was the assessment of a man who understood that the defenders had done precisely what they had been asked to do, and that what they had been asked to do had not been enough. Gaza fell on the 7th of November, 1917, 1 week after Beersheba. The fortress that had stopped 2 British offensives, that had consumed 6,500 men in the Second Battle alone, surrendered after the eastern anchor of its defensive line was removed. The logic of the Gaza-Beersheba position had always required both ends to hold. With Beersheba gone, the entire arrangement became untenable in ways that no reinforcement at Gaza could address. 7 days. On the 9th of December, 1917, Jerusalem surrendered to General Allenby. He entered the old city on foot through the Jaffa Gate, not on horseback, not in a vehicle, because arriving on foot to a city held wholly by 3 faiths sends a different message than a conqueror arriving mounted. And Allenby understood message as clearly as he understood tactics. He was the first Christian in many centuries to control Jerusalem. David Lloyd George called it a Christmas present for the British people, delivered, he did not publicly note, because a brigade of Australian horsemen had crossed an unwired plain in October. The campaign continued through 1918. In September of that year, the Battle of Megiddo brought the full consequence of Beersheba into its largest expression. Chauvel's desert-mounted corps broke through the Ottoman defensive line and rode 167 kilometers in 3 days, capturing 70,000 prisoners with the loss of approximately 600 of their own men. 3 Ottoman armies were effectively destroyed. Damascus fell. The Ottoman military position in the Middle East collapsed entirely. The same man who had said 5 words in a desert headquarters on the afternoon of October 31st commanded the largest mounted operation of the war and its most decisive. After the war, Chauvel returned to Australia and remained in uniform through the 1920s, holding together a shrunken, underfunded peacetime army through the Depression years, while his annual reports on Australia's defense preparedness were largely ignored. He became the first Australian to reach the rank of general in November 1929. He retired in 1930 with one request: to ride every day. A groom brought a horse to his house in South Yarra each morning, and he rode through the streets of Melbourne until he was too ill to mount. The grazier's son from Tabulam, who had learned to read ground on horseback before he learned to read it on a map, was still a light horseman in his 80s. He died on the 4th of March, 1945. Prime Minister John Curtin said he was one of the foremost military minds of his generation. He would have said it was just a military decision at that particular time, and it worked. The Waller horses did not come home. The animals that had carried the men of the Light Horse across the Sinai and through Palestine, bred for the Australian outback, survivors of conditions no European horse could have managed, capable of carrying 120-kilogram loads in 50-degree heat, were refused repatriation. The Australian government cited quarantine concerns and the cost of transport. The best were sold to British cavalry units for breeding. Some were sold as horse meat. Men who had worked alongside their horses for 3 years wrote home about this decision in language their families kept for decades, because the grief in it was too exact to discard. Some troopers chose to shoot their horses rather than surrender them to strangers. Ion Idris, the man who had watched the charge through binoculars and laughed when the Ottoman shells fell behind the galloping line, came home to Australia and spent the next 40 years writing about the Desert Campaign in books that sold hundreds of thousands of copies. His account of what he had seen that October afternoon was among the first descriptions many Australians ever read of what had happened on that plain. He became one of the most widely read Australian authors of the 20th century. He did not write about shooting his horse. Albert Cotter's memorial plaque was unveiled at the Sydney Cricket Ground on the 25th of January, 1919, during a break-in-play in a Sheffield Shield match. In February 2015, the Albert Cotter Bridge opened across ANZAC Parade in Sydney, opposite the ground where he had learned his slinging, lethal pace. In 2017, on the centenary of his death, Cricket New South Wales designated the 4th round of its premier cricket competition the Tibby Cotter Round. He had been assigned as a stretcher bearer on the day of the charge and had swapped places to ride. The famous photograph of the charge, the image appearing in every account, every documentary, every commemorative exhibition, is almost certainly a reenactment, staged approximately a year after the battle by the same men and horses in the same desert. Lieutenant William Hopkin James, a cavalry officer who examined the photograph carefully, noted that every man has his bayonet in his hand, and that, in the real event, you would see riderless horses going down and shells bursting among the riders. The actual charge left no photographs because nobody was standing still long enough to operate a camera. The image the world knows was assembled from the same materials, the same men, the same animals, the same ground, at a moment of safety and retrospect rather than crisis. This seems fitting in a way the men who wrote it might have found appropriate. What actually happened was faster and louder and more violent than any photograph could have held. The tactical lesson Beersheba demonstrated, that speed neutralizes firepower, that a mounted force moving fast enough across unwired ground renders a defender's range calculations irrelevant, that the psychology of a sustained charge can collapse a defense before physical contact begins, was studied in British and Commonwealth staff colleges through the 1920s and 30s. Officers who analyzed the action as cadets commanded armor in the next war. Some of the principles they carried from those classrooms were first established by a brigade of Australian horsemen who had not been watered since the previous afternoon. Beersheba is commemorated every year on the 31st of October. It has its own day. It does not have, in the national memory of Australia, the weight it perhaps deserves. Gallipoli remains the cornerstone of the ANZAC narrative. 8,700 Australian lives. Strategic failure. Heroic sacrifice against impossible odds. Beersheba was a victory, complete and decisive, achieved at comparatively low cost by men who were better at their task than the defenders they faced. It produced Jerusalem and Damascus and the end of 4 centuries of Ottoman rule in the Holy Land. National mythologies are not always rational about which stories they carry forward. Heroic failure travels further than strategic success. The Beersheba War Cemetery stands in the desert of modern Israel, in a city of nearly 200,000 people built on the ground, where Jack Cox captured 40 men with a revolver, where Albert Cotter was found the morning after, where the German officer was arrested before he could reach a third well. The white Commonwealth War graves headstones stand in the earth those men fell on. The wells that were the whole point of everything are still there. The same water, the same stone, the same ground that Abraham called his own when the world was young enough to be named. The men who rode across that plain on the afternoon of October 31st, 1917, did not do it for the monuments or the footnotes, and they received mostly footnotes in the larger chronicle of the First World War. They did it because a quiet grazier's son from Queensland looked at an aerial photograph and a racing clock and said 5 words to the man who was asking for the assignment. They did it because their horses had not had water since the previous afternoon, and the water was in the town, and the town was 4 miles away, and there was only one direction left. If this story deserves to be remembered beyond the footnotes, where it has spent the last 100 years, share it with someone who has never heard it. The horses are gone. The men are gone. The wells are still there.